Welcome back to the Politics and Media programme. The media fascination with royalty turned to tragedy this week with the death of nurse Jacinta Saldana. No one can be sure why she committed suicide, but it's being widely assumed that it was a result of a prank call by DJs at an Australian radio station to the hospital where she worked concerning Kate Middleton's pregnancy. Even before this death, some commentators were asking whether the media are devoting disproportionate attention to royal stories. Let's take a look at this report.
The world is expecting Kate and William are set to produce a future king or queen.
Tout le Royaume-Uni tourné vers Kate Middleton.
It made the headlines all over the world. Prince William and Duchess Kate are going to become parents. Nowhere was the press more excited than here in the UK, where the news of the Duchess of Cambridge's pregnancy was splashed across the front pages of all the major newspapers, with the Daily Mail issuing a royal baby special edition and others offering computerised mock-ups of what the baby might look like. Fair enough, you might say. After all, it's likely the child will one day become the king or queen of the United Kingdom. But the world's media wasn't content with just breaking the news of the royal pregnancy.
The Duchess of Cambridge is resting tonight in a
The fact that
London
the Duchess
hospital.
was suffering
She's
from
pregnant
acute
with
morning
her and
sickness
Prince William's
also filled
first
newspapers and
baby,
TV
Francis'
screens
also
across the
suffering.
globe, with journalists camping outside the hospital in London where she was being treated last week. Then, on Tuesday, a fresh media storm, caused by a prank call to the King Edward VII Hospital by two Australian radio presenters. The DJs from 2Day FM phoned the hospital pretending to be the Queen and were believed by the nurse on the other end of the line, who gave them information about Kate's condition. The drama took a tragic turn on Friday when the nurse that took the hoax call, Jacinta Saldana, was found dead in her flat in a suspected suicide. No one knows whether her death is related to the prank, but the episode has shone a light on the media frenzy that surrounds Will and Kate and the journalists who seem to follow their every move. Is our obsession with the royal couple just a symptom of superficial celebrity culture, or are the royal family a part of British identity that it's important for us all to celebrate? At a time when, in the wake of Leveson, the press is under intense scrutiny, some will be asking whether there should be more safeguards on the couple's privacy, but also whether Kate's comings and goings, designer outfits and hairstyles are really deserving of all the pages of newspaper they fill. Emily Churchill, Islam Channel.
Well, joining me to discuss these issues are Tom Mills, an investigative researcher who writes for the New Left Project, Mohammed Amin, Vice Chair of the Conservative Muslim Forum, and on the phone, Dr. Nasar Meer, Director of the Centre for Civil Society and Citizenship at Northumbria University. Welcome to the programme, everybody. So, Tom, do you think that this tragedy may focus people's attention on whether or not the media is disproportionately covering royal stories?
I hope so. I mean, the royal family have been the focus of media attention like this for a long time now. They're kind of a strange combination of celebrity culture and British officialdom, which seems to sort of branch to two sides of the British press. So, but the focus on the royal family, I think, on the one hand, it seems quite harmless in that it's part of that celebrity culture. On the other hand, it is quite political and or inherently political, I think. And I think often that's not recognised. And I think most people would agree that the political news around the world is more important than Kate Middleton's morning sickness. I don't think even royalists would suggest that it was.
Mm-hmm. Mohammed, isn't that the case, really, that whatever you think about the royal family, it's not as important as the news from Syria or the news from Egypt or the recession in this country?
Of course not. But each newspaper gives the amount of coverage to the royal family that its readers want to see. So if you read the Financial Times, you will still get news about the royal pregnancy, but you won't get many more column inches. If you read the Daily Mail or the Daily Mirror, then you get more, but that's a function of what the readers of those newspapers want to see. And if newspapers weren't serving their readers, they would stop having readers.
Let me bring Nasar in. Do you think that's the case, that in some way that it's a kind of reflection of what newspaper readers want, although there's no scientific way of telling that?
Well, it's certainly an interesting question, isn't it? I think it's probably worth breaking down just a little bit, because I can see the reason for the interest, but then I do think it's being over-reported. Now, clearly, I think the story of the royal baby is newsworthy because it's topical. You know, we all have an interest, whether you're a royalist or a Republican or something else, on changes to the line of succession because it's a constitutional matter. You know, the monarch is the head of state, and this includes his or her Majesty's government. So even though that's quite symbolic, you know, it does have a kind of constitutional role. But the question is whether, kind of beyond this topicality, the story is turned into a celebration, you know, in which lots of people will quite understandably wish to take part, but which then ceases to be news and becomes a kind of a royalist PR coup. And I suppose what would frustrate people who are interested in current affairs, since there are some really mighty, deeply profound questions and challenges that are bearing down on us, including matters of war and peace. You know, remember, we're still formally militarily involved in conflicts in a number of countries, and upheavals in the Middle East, the violence in Israel and Palestine and so on, needs to be forensically scrutinised by international media as well as kind of domestic news agencies, which are often quite fragile in those places, in order to ensure that people are not left voiceless. And I think the royal coverage does eat into that. You know, at home, of course, in terms of political economy, we're facing some of the deepest cuts into universal welfare provision since the creation of the welfare state. And in the interest of democracy and accountability, it's imperative, I think, that our mass media monitors and investigates these very topical items too.
So, Tom, what do you make of the argument that, you know, the media are simply giving people what they want?
Yeah, I just want to add to what was said there. I mean, in the case of the conflict in the Middle East, I think this is a good example of where the royal family does become politicised. I mean, if you think about Will and Harry being paraded on the television and in their military uniform, and, you know, obviously the populist media eats all that stuff up. On a certain level, it's definitely true that, but you know, the royal family is popular and people want to read these stories. But this sort of this idea that the press merely delivers people what they want. I mean, I'd say two things about that. Firstly, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? Because you deliver things to people, and people start talking about them, and then it sparks people's interest, and it's kind of a circle, isn't it? So you have to talk about what other people are talking about, and you naturally talk about things that are in the media and on television, like anyone does when they go into work. You just talk about things which you have in common with other people. The other thing is that you need to root this idea of what the media is talking about much more critically, I think. The media doesn't just deliver what people want. So if you look at, for example, I mean, this is going back a long way, but I think is relevant today. The beginnings of the press where you had a radical press, and from around like 1850 to 1870 to the modern period, the radical press disappeared and was professionalised, taken over by rich people. And there was actually the fundamental shift towards royalism in the press occurred during that time. The radical press attacked the royal family and Queen Victoria at the time, as you know, as a sort of symbol of a corrupt establishment. And then as the press became taken over by wealthy people, and it shifted towards a sort of, you know, the sort of symbolic royal family that we're used to today, the idea that they're kind of a politically neutral sort of matriarch of the country. So I think we need to look in terms of the press delivering, yes, what people want, but also, like, more profoundly than that, I think we need to look at what is the press institutionally. It's being run by rich men, funded by large corporations. Let's have a certain interest in the social structure. Now, you need to understand the press in that history. And I think royalism fits into that. It's a popular vision of society which normalises the way things are and encourages people to identify with the status quo.
Yeah, well, let me just ask Mohammed about that. I mean, it's not the case, is it, that there's a sort of direct reflection of what the readership, whatever that might be, in the amorphous mass, you know, wants from it. There are, as the Levinson inquiry has, you know, laid bare, if there were any doubt about it, very particular interests who want certain stories to appear in the press, and they appear that way.
Proprietors have certain biases at times, as we saw from what came out of Levinson, but fundamentally newspapers that don't deliver the kind of newspaper that readers want to read go out of business. And if you look at The Economist and the Financial Times, yes, they mention the royal pregnancy, they have the occasional mention of royal stories, but by and large they concentrate on other stories, hard news, international news, because that is what readers of The Economist
Can I make a point about that?
And the Financial Times, like me, want to read.
Because it's quite interesting. I'm not sure if if this is true today, but there were studies in the 1930s and the 1960s, advertiser studies, and they looked into what people read in the quality press as well in the popular press, and actually in all social classes, including people who read the tabloids, who read the broadsheets, the things that people were interested in were sports and human interest stories, the same as for the popular press. Now the difference was that economically speaking, the popular press had to build a mass readership, which meant that it naturally moved towards entertainment stories. Now the reason why magazines like the Financial Times and The Economist that you mentioned are able to focus on political stories is because they're trying to keep their publications upmarket, because the people who buy their magazines are rich people, and therefore it's easier to sell them to advertisers. They can't go down market because then they lose their value. Mass markets like, say, the Daily Mail or the Sun, they squeezed out all of their political coverage for the same economic reasons.
Well, let me bring Nasir back in there. What do you make of this debate? Is it driven by corporate interests, as Tom has suggested, by advertising revenue, or is there an impact of the readership on the content of the press?
I think there is quite rightly a question of balance here. I think that if you held the view that the mass media, particularly the print media, is meant to hold a mirror up to society and function by including a plurality of views, sometimes called liberal pluralism, then I think you'd have very good reason to revise your position of late. I mean, just take the coverage of the royals. I think for Republicans, it's been a very demoralising few years. You know, royal weddings, Jubilee, and they've been crowded out, and alternative positions haven't been aired. Now, opinion polls roughly put the Republicans around 18%. So that's certainly, you know, it's a small figure, but it's not insignificant. And one would assume that if the mass media was genuinely reflecting public debate and public opinion, they would have a expression too, but they seem to be absent from all of this discussion. Isn't that striking?
Well, I mean, that's a point, isn't it, Mohammed? I mean, if as you say, the press were reflecting the views of of people rather than pursuing an agenda in the way that Tom's suggesting, they would have to. I mean, I think actually the latest poll puts it at 22% of people think that Britain would be better off without the monarchy, and another 9% who don't know. But you haven't got 20% of the stories in the press are saying actually the monarchy's a load of rubbish and it'd be much better if we didn't have one.
That's because a mass medium like newspapers, by and large, will appeal to the largest possible audience share. So if you've got a choice, if you're publishing a paper and you can produce something that will appeal to 80% of the population or 20%, what are you going to do if you're trying to maximise sales? There are plenty of niche publications that are available to ultra-Republicans. I mean, and we have print media along the entire spectrum, from the Financial Times to stuff like Socialist Worker and Morning Star. And you buy what you're interested in, depending on what you're prepared to pay for. That's what a free press means.
Yeah, but if you're producing a mass circulation paper, you have the money behind you to set up a distribution network. You know, of course, that you have to pay to have your publications sold in stationers and so forth and so on. So it's not quite the kind of free market, is it?
Either people are prepared to buy it, in which case you'll stay in business, or people are not prepared to buy it, in which case you either go out of business or you find yourself a sugar daddy. But other than that, it is a completely free environment.
Yeah, but the point is that the free market isn't a case of people just buying newspapers and therefore newspaper becomes sustainable, you know. So you had, for example, the Daily Herald was much more widely read than the Guardian and read more attentively, but it went under because, and we're going back to like the 60s here, or possibly the 50s, I'm not sure, but it went under because it couldn't sustain advertising revenue. So it's not quite, this notion of the free market as being a direct relationship between consumer and producer just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But I think you're basically right about you know, having to sort of pander to majority views, but I think we're in danger here of saying, oh, well, you know, the newspapers will simply reflect public opinion. Well, first of all, public opinion to a certain extent is created by media. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a sort of a circuit about this. And Republican opinion goes up and down. And, you know, from around 50, it was around 50% a while back. And I think, you know, fundamentally, what do people... It's very easy to confuse the idea of monarchianism and republicanism. You know, republicanism is the notion that people should be involved with the affairs of their state. And you have a monarch at the top, that's fine. But I think part of the reason people are very sceptical about the idea of getting rid of the royal family. It's because it's a cynicism towards politics in general, and the idea that, we don't want to politicise the royal family. Well, that's, I think, a healthy suspicion of politicians, which is somehow rubbed off on the royal family, a sort of feeling that things were better in the past, and we associate the royal family with a Britain that didn't feel as corrupt as Britain does today, with wealthy people buying into politics. Wealthy people can't buy the royal family. I mean, this isn't... I don't agree with that, but you can see where the sort of vague monarchical sort of sentiment comes from.
There's some evidence, quite a lot of evidence actually, that in specific areas of the society, the view of the monarchy is very different. For instance, if you look at the situation in the opinion polls in Scotland, support for the monarchy drops from something like 70% to 50%. It's almost evenly split down the middle. Do you think that if we were to poll separately in the Muslim community, we might find more scepticism about the monarchy?
I don't know. I've never seen any statistics. I wouldn't be surprised to find that support for monarchy was less in the Muslim community than in society at large, but that's purely a guess in the absence of any hard information.
Nasar, do you think that we might find that kind of differential as we do in Scotland if we looked at the Muslim community in particular?
I'd go in the other direction. I think Muslims are broadly probably pro-monarchy, more pro-monarchy than the population at large. I think partly there's a generational component here. The first generations, especially those arriving from the Commonwealth, moved swiftly from being British subjects of the Crown to citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth through the 1948 Act. And there's a kind of a colonial hangover there, a fondness, which is partly invested in a real affection for the Queen herself. She's been around for so long, she's become a touchstone, a real kind of figure who first-generation migrants kind of revered throughout that period of decolonisation. But I think there's also more contemporary reasons why Muslims are pro-monarchy. Whatever else people think of Prince Charles, he has won a lot of hearts and minds amongst Muslims. He's been a student of Islam. He was a good friend of the late Zaki Badawi, and has on more than one occasion, sought the pluralization of the establishment settlement, famously saying, of course, that he would be defender of faith rather than the faith. Now, for second and third generation Muslims, my informed guess, for that is what it is, I don't have any data for this, I suspect would show a kind of an evening out for support for the monarchy, which would be comparable to the population at large. And in many respects, that's just the process of integration.
What do you think about, it's very interesting in the polls that although people say they support the monarchy and therefore, by definition, support the hereditary principle, actually when they're asked who they want the next monarch to be, they don't want Prince Charles, they do want William by a significant kind of a difference in percentage terms. So it's kind of, I like the hereditary principle, I like the monarchy, but I actually don't like how it works.
Well, this goes back to Tom's point earlier, which was the figures on republicanism go up and down. And one argument I would make is that people have a lot of affection for the Queen, and there's a great stability in her being the figurehead of this royal family. When that changes, the question will be much more open, there will be more contestation and debate. And if you are right in your assumption that Charles is a more divisive character, well, those who are pessimistic now may be more optimistic in a few years' time.
Well, what do you make of those figures, Tom, that, that people, sort of generally support the monarchy, but actually don't support the hereditary principle when it comes to who the next monarch's going to be?
Yeah, I think it shows the superficial level of engagement, doesn't it, with the idea of monarchy. I wonder really underneath the figures how much of an attachment to the idea of monarchy there really is today. I mentioned when we started that it seems to be that the monarchy has kind of merged with mainstream sort of celebrity culture in a way. We're being sold this couple as an ordinary pair of people, which is the opposite of what monarchy really is. But this is the weakness of looking at opinion polls. First of all, opinion polls shift up and down. Public opinion changes and responds to different social structures like the media. And secondly, they don't really demonstrate a depth of feeling. You're asked to tick one box or the other. It doesn't tell you anything that sort of qualitative about why people are attached to these institutions. And I expect a lot of it is to do with another sort of not really monarchical principle of the Queen seeming like an ordinary person or a sort of mother of the nation and being associated with things that actually we don't associate Britain with today. The idea of public service. I mean, what do people really say when they talk about the Queen, or even when they're evoking ideas of the military? It's usually this idea of self-sacrifice and service to the country, which people, you know, is appealing to people. When we think of the corruption that we see in politicians and the financial markets, the idea of actually serving, I think, has a certain old-fashioned appeal to it. And, you know, the Queen is kind of a symbol of that post-war age, isn't she? Where we all felt like we went through the Second World War and we're all in it together, as Cameron says now. I think the Queen symbolises that for certain people. But again, how genuinely do those polls reflect attachment to the monarchy? I think a lot of it is a suspicion of what it would replace, and part of that is the feeling that, you know, what would really change in society if we just got rid of these symbols at the top. I mean, and that's correct, I think. Very little. The problem with society isn't that we have a queen or a monarchy. The problem is that society is very unequal and it's run by bankers and corrupt politicians.
Well, what do you think of that point, Mohammed, that essentially kind of support for the monarchy is a kind of migration of lack of support for other institutions in society that seem to be corrupt, unwillingness to think that, you know, that all too fallible politicians should be a head of state, that it's a kind of mirror image of distrust of the rest of the system that's reflecting positively onto the monarchy?
Well, first of all, I agree with Tom that you need to look at opinion polls and interpret them with great care. And secondly, it's quite clear, as Tom was saying, that the public's devotion for the Queen derives from 60 years of selfless service to the country. And she's put any sort of personal interest that she might have had of her own to one side and concentrated on doing the job incredibly well. So, for example, the Queen has had private meetings every week, year after year, with every Prime Minister, and it never leaks. And it's not surprising
Until
that...
recently.
Not from the Queen, it doesn't leak. And
from Charles. Yeah.
And that kind of service merits and gives rise to this kind of loyalty. And people do look at politicians whose views change sort of from time to time in a somewhat unreliable ways at times, and compare that with the Queen, and it's not surprising the Queen is more popular than politicians.
So Tom, do you think that, you know, the sort of hang on to nurse for fear of something worse element in support for the monarchy, do you see that changing ever, or would you see it changing after the Queen dies, perhaps?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think to a certain extent it's the weakness of republicanism that it's not able to offer more than just a sort of head of a change at the top, you know. Nobody wants to see another politician replacing the Queen. If you want to make society better, you have to offer people more than changing something which they think is basically harmless. And a lot of people say that, you know, I'm not a royalist, but what can you offer me that's any better? And then people usually mention the United States or France and particularly the States, you know, and they don't see that as a very sort of alluring example for people. So I think, you know, fundamentally, if Republicans are going to be successful, they're going to have to engage more adequately, I think, with Britain as it is today. Not as, so, you know, if they accept that the Queen is largely symbolic, then, well, what's the case for removing the Queen?
Okay, well, let me just bring that in for a last comment then. Do you think that that what's happening in Scotland is because there is something greater than simply republicanism on offer here, and that is then reflected in the lower support for the monarchy?
I think, for good or for ill, the monarchy in Scotland is associated with an English activity. However you want to phrase that, even though the Union of Crowns in Scotland predates the Act of Union by 100 years, and, you know, James I was obviously a Scot. It seemed to be an English activity at a time when there's an aspirational Scottish nationalism around which people can mobilise and gather. And it's quite progressive nationalism, and those words sound a bit oxymoronic, don't they?
Well, I'm going to have to stop you there on that oxymoron, because we've run out of time. But please do join us for future editions of the Politics and Media programme.